This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 449 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Fantasy football was very weird and low-scoring last week, but there were still some good hits on this matchup show. There were some bad ones, though, too. I pretty much missed on every quarterback pick, partially because games didn't go as I thought, but also because of really obnoxious touchdown variants like with Jared Goff. But I was right to be high on Ronald Jones. Kalen Ballage kept seeing a lot of volume. That was good to see. Josh Reynolds had the best game of his season. There was still some good to this show. I did miss on DJ Moore, but I'm not really that annoyed at that one. I think the process was right overall. But we're on to week 11, and hopefully it's a week that's a little bit less tilting from a fantasy perspective. Now, before looking at some players that I'm higher and lower on this week versus the consensus, I want to let you know that UFC 255 is set to take place this weekend. And the people at FanDuel Sportsbook are offering bettors some protection on their bets with their UFC decision insurance. Right now, if you place a pre-fight moneyline wager on UFC 255, you'll be eligible to get up to $1,000 back if your fighter loses by split decision or majority decision. That's right, simply place a moneyline bet before the fight begins, and you're in line to receive a refund if your fighter loses by decision. I know absolutely nothing about UFC, but this sounds like a good deal. The weekend will be here before you know it, so download the FanDuel Sportsbook mobile app and place your UFC 255 bets today. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Indiana, Colorado, and Iowa. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit. Max refund $1,000. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. And in Iowa, call 1-800-BETS-OFF. Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston is a streamer this week. With Drew Brees sidelined, I fully expect Winston to see the majority of the snaps for New Orleans at quarterback, with Taysom Hill kind of sprinkled in. And considering this game is one of the higher over-unders on the slate, that's a good thing. Atlanta is the perfect matchup for Winston to get off on the right foot. They've performed 7 points per game below expectation when looking at opponent-adjusted fantasy points per game. To put that another way, if Winston averaged 13 points per game typically, let's say, we'd expect him to be closer to 20 points against Atlanta because this matchup is so favorable. So I think he's the top streamer this week, even though he does come with plenty of risk. If you'd rather play someone who's a little bit safer but may not give you the same type of ceiling, you could go with Kirk Cousins. Cousins has given us 14 or more fantasy points in all but 2 games this year. And he gets a beatable Dallas D that's been a top half matchup in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. I do think that there is some fear that the Vikings are just going to end up being super run heavy in a positive game script in this matchup. But that's sort of what we've seen from them throughout the season. They've been run heavy. And on the season, Cousins has played just slightly below expectation when you look at his points per game scored and adjust that for strength of opponent. Since Dallas has been pretty bad against quarterbacks, if Cousins is just slightly below that average, it's easy to see a path to 17 or so points. It's not thrilling, but that's sort of what we're working with in week 11. I mean, honestly, with Cousins, you can look at the Vikings team total and see that it's pretty high at 27.5 points. That's according to FanDuel Sportsbook. If they put up that kind of total, you just have to hope that the way that they score touchdowns is through the air and not on the ground. An even deeper play this week that you could go with is Phillip Rivers. Now hear me out. The Colts team total is almost as high as Minnesota's this week. It's almost 27 points. They get the Packers in a game that could have a lot more back and forth action than what Kirk Cousins is going to see with Minnesota versus Dallas. It's just that the matchup isn't as strong because the Packers have been a top 5 team in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks. But Rivers has also not been all that bad of late. Over his last 4 games, he's averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game, and that includes a contest against Baltimore where he only scored 7. The other thing to note about this game is that when I look at the pressure chart that I generate every week, it favors Indianapolis' offense more than any other offense in week 11. That's because the Packers have one of the worst pressure rates in football, and Indianapolis has been very good at protecting Phillip Rivers. I don't think he's like a must play. I can understand if you would rather go with Cousins. It's probably the safer bet. I'm mostly just noting that I think that Rivers is way undervalued this week. And then one quarterback on the other side of things, I don't love Ryan Tannehill this week against Baltimore. The Ravens are a below average matchup from a fantasy points allowed perspective, and they've given up just 2 top 10 performances this year. One of those was to Patrick Mahomes. The Titans have just a 21-point team total in this game, and Tannehill himself has started to regress. This was something that I was afraid of and I talked about on this show, on the Late Round podcast, when I had Tannehill as a sell. But over his last 4 games, he's ranked no better than QB 14 in weekly scoring while averaging just 15 points per game. Across his first 5 matchups, he was averaging over 23 points per game. Now, as I said on the 10 Trends episode yesterday, Duke Johnson was one of 2 running backs in Week 10 with a 100% running back rush share. The problem was that the Houston game was played in horrific weather, so neither offense could really do anything. That should be hopefully a little bit different for Houston in Week 11. The matchup isn't the best in the world against New England, but that game is a reasonably high 49-point over-under, at least for this slate. And the Patriots haven't been great against opposing running backs this year. They're the 11th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So don't get frustrated with last week's performance from Duke Johnson. The game environment should be better in this one. Now let's take a second once again to talk about Ronald Jones versus Leonard Fournette. Seeing rankings this week, it's just a reflection of what happened the previous week. When Fournette was better than Jones for consecutive weeks, he was ranked ahead. Now that Jones had a good game, he's ahead. And I'm seeing talk about how their performances have just been so unpredictable over the last few weeks. But to reiterate what I said last week, I don't think that's totally the case. Jones fumbled a few weeks ago, so Fournette took over. The next week, there was a super negative game script, so Fournette took over again, because he's the pass-catching back. Against Carolina this past week, though, it was a nice positive game script, and Jones ended the day with 74% of the team's running back rushes. Thankfully, Arians didn't just go to Fournette after Jones fumbled the ball early in the game. But here's the thing. This is why I reference market share so often on this podcast. In Week 9 against New Orleans, Rojo saw 75% of the team's running back rushes. It was on a super small sample, but when you translate that type of market share then to a game with a good matchup and a positive script, you get what happened in Week 10. What I'm getting at is, this is a game script dependent backfield. I'm going to favor Fournette when games could go south, and then I'll favor Ronald Jones in very obvious positive game scripts. I think the ranking between the two should almost be back-to-back this week as a result, because they're facing a good Rams team and they're only 3.5-point favorites. I just wanted to bring up that situation on today's show because to me, it's simpler than most people are making it out to be. I mentioned Devontae Booker as the 16th transaction this week on the 15 Transactions episode, and I actually think that he's in play as a deep play at running back. He's now seen 39% of the Raiders' running back rushes over the last 2 weeks. But I should note that in last week specifically, the Raiders saw a nice positive game script. Now they get Kansas City. Even though they beat the Chiefs earlier this season, we know it's possible the Raiders fall into a negative script pretty easily. But here's the thing, the Raiders have lost 2 games this year where they saw a clear negative script. One against the Patriots, one against the Buccaneers. Weeks 3 and 7. In those games, Josh Jacobs saw 2 of his 3 lowest snap shares of the season. The other low snap share that he saw came last week when they got really far ahead. The other point to make here is that Booker has had a higher proportion of touches come via the air than on the ground versus Jacobs. We've seen some funky stuff happen in the past for Josh Jacobs usage-wise when the Raiders have trailed. And that could happen in this game with the Raiders as 7-point underdogs. If that's the case, we may see a little bit more Booker. And that could lead to some fantasy points because Kansas City has seen 21.5% of their receiving yards allowed go to running backs this year. That's the second highest mark in the league. And then if you want a super deep play where you just completely bet on game script, you could look at Alexander Mattison. Minnesota's a 7-point favorite against Dallas, and Madison's highest running back rush share game this year came in a game where the Vikings won convincingly. At least highest running back rush share with Dalvin Cook healthy. That was in Week 9 against Detroit, where Madison had 12 carries. If you look at the season, Minnesota's only gotten 4 wins, and they haven't been convincing like that one. If they get one of those super positive script convincing wins this week, it's easy to see a path for double-digit touches for Alexander Mattison. But this is nothing more than a desperation play. Over the last 3 weeks, Jonathan Taylor has averaged a running back rush share per game under 30%. His target share per game has been 6.5%. Those are really, really bad numbers. So even if this matchup against Green Bay is good, and even if it's easy to see the upside this matchup could bring, I would much rather Taylor be on my bench than in my starting lineup. If he hits, then great. But recent history does not tell us that he's going to be in line for this monster workload. So he's the one player who I thought was riskiest when looking at the top 35 or 40 running backs this week. It's easy to fall in love with the matchup. I get it. We know that Jonathan Taylor at least has a ceiling. He has a lot of potential. But that potential is meaningless right now because it's not even remotely predictable. Christian Kirk ranked as the wide receiver 55 last week in a decent spot, but he had an 18.8% target share in that Arizona offense. He's now got a 15.7% share on the season, and over the last 3 games, he's averaging almost a 23% target share per game. That should absolutely come in handy against the Seahawks. Seattle has been the absolute worst team by far in adjusted points allowed to wideouts, and that game is the highest over-under on the week. I know some of you will listen to this after that game is concluded, so hopefully I look kind of smart, but I do think that Kirk is slightly undervalued in Week 11 given the game environment. Most of you are probably going to start Christian Kirk this week, so I figured that I'd do what I usually do on this show and give you some deep options at wide receiver, guys who might even be on your waiver wire. Now, I mentioned Josh Reynolds on this week's 15 Transaction show and how he's been out-targeting Robert Woods since Week 4. It's why I can't really comprehend how Woods is a top 20 wide receiver by the consensus this week, while Reynolds is wide receiver 53. They continue to run the same amount of routes, too. It's not like Reynolds is just seeing an unsustainable utilization rate. I don't think he's like a slam dunk play. I'm just noting that if you're high on Woods, you should be high on Reynolds. Or logic at least tells us that. I do think it's more of a Cooper Kupp week, though. Keelan Cole has had random spikes in fantasy production this season, and he had a good outing last week against Green Bay. He saw 20.6% of the team's targets. He got 5 of 7 targets for 47 yards and a touchdown. It was a good outing. That was without Laviska Shenault in the lineup. So we saw Cole with an 81% snap share, his highest of the season. Now here's the thing though, Cole will still play a good number of snaps even if Shenault goes. And I like the slot matchup that he's going to see against Pittsburgh this week. The Jags will likely see a negative game script. That means more throws, and according to Pro Football Focus, Keelan Cole has played over 2/3 of his snaps this year from the slot. He had a 62% slot snap rate last week. Pittsburgh continues to be bad against slot guys, at least compared to how they typically defend players. They've allowed the second highest target rate to the slot this year. This is why I mentioned Tyler Boyd on the show last week. And the Bengals had 15 slot targets against Pittsburgh for 139 yards and 10 receptions. I said that backwards, but you get the picture. Boyd was fine enough, but T. Higgins was the one who really took advantage on his 15 slot snaps in that game, going for 79 yards from that area of the field on 3 catches. So maybe Keelan Cole takes advantage this week. You could also look at Rashard Higgins. To reiterate what I've been saying on the show all week, we can't really assume the Browns' offense is as bad as they've been the last 2 games. They've played in really bad weather. Last week, Higgins saw 21% of Cleveland's targets. He's now gone over the 20% target share mark in 2 of 3 games without Odell Beckham. That's as long as you include the game where Beckham got hurt. Now he's got a matchup against an Eagles team that's just been completely average against wide receivers. Even if Higgins sees some Darius Slay, I think volume alone should give him a better ranking than where he's being ranked right now, which is wide receiver 59. Now, the Bucs running back situation is hard to decipher. I already talked about that. But so is the wide receiver one. You've got Antonio Brown versus Chris Godwin versus Mike Evans, and it's tough to know which direction to go in each week. I can at least say that I don't like Mike Evans this week because he's probably going to see a lot of Jalen Ramsey. But the Rams secondary has been really, really good. They're the absolute best in adjusted points allowed to wide receivers, and they've only allowed 2 top 20 performances this year. One of those performances was in Week 1 to Amari Cooper, and the other came against Deebo Samuel in Week 6, where his average depth of target was -5 yards. So he really wasn't even playing traditional wide receiver. Downgrade the Bucs wide receivers this week and the passing attack in general. I talked about Logan Thomas on the 15 Transaction show this week, so I won't get into that much detail, but I don't mind him this week at all. He's seen a decent target share this year at about 16%. He's in a more efficient offense, it seems like, with Alex Smith. And the Bengals are one of the best matchups for a tight end this year. So you can easily play Thomas as a streamer this week. There's also my guy Mo Alley Cox. Jack Doyle's still in concussion protocol while I'm recording this, and last week, Mo Alley-Cox ran more routes and saw more targets than Trey Burton. If Doyle is out, I like Mo Alley-Cox as a streamer in a game that should force the Colts to throw the ball a little bit more than they might want to. Lastly, and I can't believe that I'm saying this, but if you play on ESPN or another platform that allows for Taysom Hill to be thrown in at tight end, I'm not against it. He could hypothetically see more snaps with Drew Brees out. But that's just narrative driven. At the very least, even if we remove that narrative, he's seen almost 7 carries per game over his last 3 contests. It's not like he's been totally worthless at putting up fantasy points. So in that high over-under game against Atlanta, I kind of like Hill as a streamer if you can use him at tight end. I wouldn't use him at quarterback, though. The Cleveland Browns were the 15 transactions defense this week, and I still believe in them as a streamer. The Eagles are the 6th best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed. They have the highest sack rate allowed in football, and the Browns have been above average at getting to opposing quarterbacks. So I'm in on the Cleveland Browns. And I think New England is a little bit undervalued this week. People might be scared off of them because of Deshaun Watson, and I get it. But Houston's been well below average in pressure rate allowed and sacks allowed this year. New England is 3rd in the NFL in pressure rate. It'd be nice if Stephon Gilmore played, but I still think the Patriots work. That's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And of course, don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly mailbag show.